Innovate. Enable.
Hello and welcome to KPMG Presents Budget 2018, the fine print powered by CNBC TV 18, and I'm your host Nitya Balakrishnan. Joining me on this special show today is a very power-packed panel: Hitesh Gujaria, partner KPMG India; Rodney Lawrence, Global Head International Tax KPMG LLP; Amit Gupta, Tax Head Dell India; Balasubramaniam, Global Head Corporate Taxation at Wipro. And Rodney, let me begin by asking you, just a few days ago we did see the first major overhaul of the federal tax system in more than 3 decades announced by the United States. What, according to you, are the key takeaways of that announcement?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's been more than 30 years since major tax reform in the United States, and this is actually very meaningful for business. So a couple of key takeaways. First of all, the new corporate tax rate is 21%, down from 35%. There's a new export tax rate of 13%, down from 35%. 100% tax write-off of all capital investments for the next 5 years. On the downside, restrictions on interest deductions and a new anti-avoidance rule that denies deductions for payments to certain related parties. So quite a lot of things.
Absolutely. Let me come across to you, Hitesh. As far as your initial assessment of the announcement by the US government is concerned, how do you think this will impact India and the way India does business in the United States?
Well, the US being one of the largest trading partners of India, India will have to structurally rethink its business models. The new regime is obviously make in America very attractive. Indians have traditionally supplied services. How the new BEAT tax for related party transactions is going to pan out is something that India Incorporate is watching very closely. And I think it's going to bring about a structural change in the way that India does business going forward with the United States.
Fantastic. Now, if I can bring Amit into the conversation. Amit, the Indian Finance Minister was also echoing similar sentiments of bringing down corporate tax rates. This budget, we didn't see that particular announcement for bigger companies. So, how do you think India should go forward as far as reducing tax rate is concerned?
Yeah, so I think, the finance minister reduced the corporate tax rate for companies with turnover up to 250 crores. They brought it down to 25%. Definitely there is room to bring in the bigger companies and reduce the corporate tax rate, because that would incentivize more things to happen in India and more activities to grow. So definitely it's something that should be done. Now, time will tell as to when it happens, but definitely something to look at, because if you look at US bringing the tax rate down to 21, you look at United Kingdom, the tax rate is 19, look at Germany, the tax rate is about 16.
Correct.
So all the big players are either at 20 or less than 20. So we have to see where do we want to be. Do we want to be in that group, or how we have to, because if we really want to grow over a period of time, I think we'll have to get there.
Fair point. Now, Bala, I have a two-pronged question for you. Considering that your company has operations in the United States as well, how do you welcome the move of, reduction in corporate tax rates by the United States government? And B, of course, like I asked Amit, do you think India should push ahead when it comes to reducing the corporate tax rates for bigger companies?
I'll take the second question first, because, we are an Indian headquartered company, so the Indian rate is more applicable, because we have large operations in India as well. Right, so who would not like to have a lower corporate tax rate, right? So every company would aspire for a lower corporate tax rate, but you have to look at the fiscal space that was available to the finance minister. So therefore, within what was available to him, he has done as much as he could, for the SME sector. So that is most welcome. But what we were expecting is, at least a word spoken on when the rate would come down for the larger players, right? Because he promised, that to come down over a period of 4 years. Now we are sitting on the 4th year of his, term. Correct. So at least he could have said that, we have a visibility of 2 years, 3 years, 1 year, something could have been spoken on that. I think that's where we are a little worried in terms of where we go with the corporate tax rate, because these are long-term planning that companies do when they have to take up investments. So from that perspective, there could have been a little more clarity on when the rates would come down for the bigger players. We don't grudge that it has not happened this year, but there could have been clarity. A. B is while there corporate tax rate is important, what is also important is an ecosystem of tax administration which is a lot more conducive for the ease of doing business in India.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a lot more to be done in that direction as well. So the government can work on that aspect as well. So that's on the India side. On the US side, I think the corporate tax rate coming down is a big positive. I think it's going to move a lot of operations to the US. Companies like us, which have a large customer base in the US, right? We would benefit from the corporate tax rate. So that's very a welcome step by the US government, and we would stand to benefit from that particular aspect.
Well, before I go to Rodney on BEAT, an interesting comment, Hitesh, by the Chief Economic Advisor was the corporate tax rates in India will be tapered lower once GST, revenues pick up. Do you have any timeline before when we could actually see that happen?
Well, I think GST has begun well, and it is a matter of time, and I would give it maybe a year or two maximum till GST really settles down well and starts giving really the benefits that everybody is hoping for, not just in terms of more tax collections, widening the tax base, but more importantly, easing the cascading of taxes and releasing that much extra energy into the GDP as such. So I think it's a matter of 1 or 2 years, possibly, if that space comes through, as Bala mentioned. Then over the next 1 or 2 years, I'm hopeful that all of India's corporate tax rates could be going much lower from what they are today.
Well, fair point. Rodney, a lot of companies, not just in India, but across the globe, are wondering what exactly the BEAT provision is about and how it will impact business with the United States. Now, can you throw the spotlight on BEAT and what it really means for the companies doing business with the US?
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, first of all, BEAT fundamentally is aimed at tackling the problem where your US subsidiary makes deductible payments to a foreign affiliate. And all that BEAT does is it says, hey, where these rules apply, when we compute taxable income, we will add back those expenses. We don't care about transfer pricing. We just care if it's paid to a related party, and that will have the impact of increasing the tax cost because you're making related party payments. The reason for that is the incentive is to locate all the operations within the United States where you won't have that tax cost. That is the impact of BEAT.
Well, if I can ask you, Bala, to elaborate on what the impact would be for companies like yourself, which is headquartered in India but does operations across the globe and in the United States as well.
So it's going to certainly have an impact, when we have customer contracts with our US subsidiary.
Correct.
And then we subcontract the Indian work to the Indian entity that is located in India, right? So it's going to make the outsourcing a lot more costlier, because we are going to pay a little more corporate tax rate, corporate tax, in the US.
Correct.
Right. Having said that, I think it's a play of arithmetic, right? Larger you are, smaller is going to be the impact of BEAT, because it's going to be a proportion of the taxable income that you have in the US vis-a-vis your size of outsourcing to India, right? So the larger players are going to play with the volume in the US so that they can outsource a lot more, to get the labor arbitrage, whatever, that they want to achieve from outsourcing.
Correct.
So they would like to, kind of, do the play. So the smaller players who don't have that, the financial interplay, so they are going to be affected by the BEAT.
Fair point then. Amit, your situation is slightly different from that of Bala. So for MNCs, with operations in India, you're not looking at it from Bala's perspective. How does BEAT impact a company like yourself?
Yeah, so I think we do have large operations in India. So what we need to look at is really as to it's all fact based. We'll have to look at the numbers. As Bala mentioned, the larger you make profits, the lesser could be the impact and all of it. It's very fact based. But at a very high level, given what we know of, given the fact that cost of goods sold will not be part of it, and there are a lot of line items which will be not part of this calculation. We believe it should not be a big impact, and even if it is, given that the tax rate is 21% now, there is room to play with. From 35 it's come down to 21, and even if there's a beat, there would be room to play with. So should not be a big impact is a high level assessment. One will have to look at the facts and overall then come to a judgment. I just wanted to add one more comment on the tax rate point from an India perspective. Given the fact that we have dividend distribution tax, our tax rate actually is not 35. If you add it up, it's close to 50%. So really, the numbers that I was speaking about earlier, we are way above. We are almost more than twice of what the global average is. So we really need to think about how we incentivize corporates.
Fair point there. Now, if I can once again throw the discussion back to Rodney, when you talk about such sweeping tax reforms that the United States has announced, there is also the fear of, a $1 trillion deficit when you actually look at implementation of these reforms from tax revenues. How is the government looking at bridging or funding that deficit?
Well, it's a great question, and that's a very big number. What the government believes is the combination of all of the parts of tax reform will incentivize people to move economic activity back to the United States, move jobs, or in the case of 100% expensing, purchase automation, move manufacturing, so on and so forth. And they believe that the increased economic activity will to some degree pay for tax reform. Time will tell. Time will tell.
Well, Hitesh, as far as India's understanding is concerned, and how will the US tax reforms actually play out when you talk about the business sentiment and corporate sector here in India?
Well, I think the US has played a huge protectionist move, if I may call it that way. They want economic activity to come back to the United States. Certainly that's going to cause a change in the way business has been conducted. Supply chains will change, customer contracts will change, the way you carry out business itself is going to fundamentally change. I think India needs to be conscious of what's happening all over the world. We need to be competitive. Tax rates is just one of them, but ease of doing business, the entire implementation of all our tax reforms, the GST be it, or the new e-assessment which is being promised. Holistically, I think India, if it gets its act together, then one can hope for a great boost, given that the US rates are also down. If there is headspace, India also will progressively taper down. So all in all, exciting times to watch whether we'll be able to walk that talk.
You also mentioned the provision about 100% expensing allowed in capex investment, and that's a huge reform coming in as well. How is that likely to play out?
So this is a big thing, and it's across all the press that lots of US businesses are repatriating a lot of cash, and they need to spend that money on something. The tax reform allows you to write off 100% of your capex spending over the next several years. And so a lot of businesses are evaluating whether to purchase automation to invest in capacity in the United States. So we're thinking that it will cause a real revival in capital spending in the United States and an increase in productivity. It's actually a very, very big thing, and a lot of our clients are evaluating bringing forward capital spending because of it.
Well, if Amit, you can jump into this conversation then. What do you read of this move really by the United States government?
I think it's a great move. It's really like, I think we can pick a leaf out of the book of the US tax reforms, really, in terms of we also allowing something similar to this. We do have, but I think this is something, it's like a sweeping thing, which is being allowed to almost everyone, every corporate. And I think this is something which will help the GDP, the economy, and it's a great move, something that we can also look at.
So like make in India more invest in the United States. Now Bala, what would you like to add on?
See, what is interesting also is, with the capital expensing, there's also no minimum alternate tax, right? The alternate minimum tax, which is in the which was there in the US books till last year, that's been removed. It's equivalent of our MAT. right? And that's a added impetus. We have such incentives, but we levy a MAT, which is almost 2/3 of the corporate tax rate, and that's where our problem is, right? So along with the corporate tax rate, we also need to look at MAT, which is what US did with the capital expensing. It's double sweetener.
Absolutely. Would you agree with that, Hitesh? What can the government do as far as India Inc. is concerned to actually increase ease of doing business when you talk about from a pure controlling corporate taxes perspective?
So I think clearly a lot to learn from what US has done. I believe that some of this might be addressed in the new direct taxes code, which is on the anvil.
Correct.
I think the government needs to step back and say, look, the entire scene as far as the US is concerned has changed. They are fundamentally rewriting the code, if you will, to incentivize everything which moves back to the US. I'm also wondering whether, Rodney, and you can comment on it, whether this sort of leeway or room that people will have because of the expenses, the extra cash flow that they will have, whether that will go into more automation, more artificial intelligence, more technology investment, which will push up productivity and which really will give tangible gains going forward. So I think that's also a step to watch out for. Would you agree?
Would you agree?
Yeah, Hitesh, I totally agree. And in fact, that's the plan. When you read some of the press releases from some of the multinational clients, that's what they're planning to invest in. Automation, increased productivity, bring manufacturing and service capacity back to the United States. It very much sounds like a trade policy in that way.
Interesting. Now, the commentary about interest limitation, Rodney, if you can throw some light onto that for the benefit of our viewers.
Yeah, sure. So what we've talked about so far is a whole raft of different policies aimed at moving things back to the United States. Lots of carrots and sticks. Interest expense is a stick. So we've had a change in rules where now it's harder to deduct interest expense. You can only deduct up to 30% of EBITDA, whereas before it was a much higher number. The consequence of that for a lot of our clients is they need to think about, well, am I now over leveraged in the US and do I need to adjust my capital structure? And how do I do that? Because interest rates in the United States are still very low and attractive.
Absolutely. Now, Bala, if I can have concluding comments from you, when you talk about how do we better tweak the corporate tax structure here in India, like I asked Hitesh, to ensure that, like the US is saying, make in the United States, invest into the United States, how can we do that with respect to India?
No, I think we need to have a very concerted strategy on the corporate tax rate for sure, right? But also we need to look at the individual taxation as well, because that's where the consumption is going to be given impetus, and so that is also critical. So we should not lose sight of the individual taxation, because the US tax reform equally addressed the individual taxation, the personal taxation side as well.
Fair point.
So having said that, on the corporate tax side, I thought we were moving in the right direction with the finance minister coming in 4 years back and said we are going to have the rates slide down over a 4-year period. It did happen for like he said, 99% of the companies, but we should not lose sight that the 1% of the companies contribute a lot more.
Correct.
In terms of corporate income, etc. So we need to look at that in a very time bound manner. The clarity needs to be given to the corporate India. And what he said on the incentives, phasing out, that has already happened. So we know when the incentives are going to phase out. So given that we know what is going off, we should also know, what is going to come back into the corporate kitty.
Absolutely. And would you agree with this, Amit, your concluding comments on what timeline are you really envisioning for corporate tax to be tapered off in the country?
Yeah, I think sooner the better is what I would say. I think the more we wait, the more we are not going to gain, because if you look at countries outside, everyone is reducing. US is done, UK, as I mentioned, everybody is like 20 or less than that. So we have to do sooner rather than later. In terms of the interest deductibility that Rodney was mentioning, I think India also did that, but it did it only on the related party interest. But US has done it across the board, which in my view is like quite a limiting factor, because that you are telling corporates don't borrow, don't leverage yourself to expand, which sort of at one point you are saying I allow you 100% capital deduction. But on the other hand, you're saying don't borrow. So there seems to be a a sort of a conflict between, because then I may not be able to get capital from whom some people may not invest. So I think there seems to be a, I think each country has got its own nuances.
True.
We have our own. Sooner the better. I think we'll have to look at how we can change the game towards our country. I think that's what we'll have to look at.
The sooner the better is the word coming in when it comes to reduction of India's corporate tax rates from our panel of experts. With that, we're absolutely timed out on the budget fine print. From the entire team that put the show together, goodbye and thanks for watching.